Good day, listeners. How is everyone going? Welcome to the new week on the Silly Talks podcast. I'm your host, Saba, from the Silly McWiggles project, and I still can't believe this is already season 4 of my show. This week, I have invited another amazing guest who is trying to make the music business in Australia and beyond a better place, so to speak. But before I reveal their name, let me ask you a few questions to set the context for this chat. Do the festivals you attend normally offer a safe space for neurodiverse people? Do you pay attention to whether a live music venue is wheelchair accessible? And did you know there are also successful deaf musicians out there? If you've answered no to any of those questions, this chat is definitely for you. But I'm not the expert here. Morwenna Collett is an accomplished consultant, leader and facilitator passionate about increasing accessibility within the music industry. She has worked with the arts, government, not-for-profit and university sectors and recently completed a Churchill Fellowship investigating inclusive music programs, venues and festivals that actively engage disabled people across the USA, UK and Ireland. Her work is informed by her own lived experience as a musician with a disability, which I think is a very important factor here. You'll find out more about Morwenna and her research in the Anchor episode, as usual. But first, we're going to discuss diversity, access and inclusion in Australia, its creative arts sector, and particularly the music side of it. But of course, I wouldn't be myself if I didn't start the conversation with a blunt, direct question. Is Australia ready for disabled musicians today?
Certainly a lot more ready than it was 20 years ago, but I think it's still not always a really straightforward path for musicians that have access requirements. There are definitely music companies and organisations that are a lot more open and willing to kind of work with people around what they might need to be able to do their best work as a musician or as an arts worker. But yeah, we're certainly not there yet. But at least the thing that's happening now is the dialogue's really opening up about it. We're starting to have a lot more conversations about it in the last probably 5 years than we've ever had before. And I think it's getting momentum. It's getting more of a profile and a spotlight. Organisations are really realising that they don't have a choice anymore. They've got to do something, and they can't kind of just have their head in the sand and ignore it. They've really got to, do something. But it can be, when you think sort of diversity and inclusion rather than just disability, it's a big field and it's a big area. And so sometimes it's really hard to know where to start. Do I sort of focus in as a music org just on accessibility, or should I be doing, First Nations or people of colour or, women? There's so many different underrepresented groups in our industry. Sometimes it can be a challenge to know where to kind of dive in.
Sure. And I don't know how to ask this question so you don't misunderstand me, because I don't have any physical disability, so I probably look at everything from an able person's perspective, and which is obviously a shame. And I also come from a country where I don't think we pay enough attention to it, and generally from maybe not culture, but kind of geographic area. So, and when I think of disability, the first thing that comes to my mind would probably be the physical one, which is, someone in a wheelchair. But this is obviously a much broader subject. So could you perhaps talk me through what kind of disabilities, are the ones that are not represented? So, and especially in the music world, because I can understand, it's hard for musicians who are in the wheelchairs, for example, to even get on stage. So that would be something that I instinctively would think of, but I can imagine there's many more forms. So would you be able to tell me more about it?
Yeah, absolutely. And you're not alone, Saba. Most people go straight to physical access. We've got our international symbol of disability as a wheelchair, so it does make us think immediately of that. But amazingly, only 4% of people with disability are actually wheelchair users. So we're a lot broader group than that. And in fact, a lot of people in the music industry and a lot of people in general actually have hidden or invisible disability, like myself. So it's up around the kind of 80 to 90% of people with disability have some sort of invisible disability. And for me, that really kind of brings home the fact that we need to talk about access requirements. We need to ask people, what sort of access requirements do you have? Because we can't make assumptions about things that we can't see. So invisible disability is big, and within there we've got, of course, mental health, which there's a lot of that kind of stuff going on in the music industry, and also neurodiversity is something that we're starting to talk about a lot more as well. So, people who might be on the autism spectrum, for example, people who might benefit from having more relaxed performance opportunities, people who've got some sort of sensory sensitivity. And then, of course, there are all the other sensory disabilities as well. So we've got, there's of course, a lot of incredible blind and low vision musicians and audience members out there. And what we're starting to talk about more here in Australia is actually deaf and hard of hearing musicians and audience members as well. And I think that's a really interesting, evolving area that's got a lot of possibilities when it comes to kind of things like tech and, wearing wearables and kind of sub packs and feeling vibrations through music, which for, some people from the deaf community, that's really exciting and something they enjoy. So I always like to think of disability as one of the broadest diversity groups. We are a group of people that crosses across all of those other diversity groups as well. So intersectionality is really important to consider, because what about people with disability that have multiple layers of disadvantage? So our First Nations communities here in Australia, it's 1 in 5 of the Australian population generally that have disability, but for our First Nations communities, it's 1 in 2. So there's a much higher prevalence of disability, and you can imagine that kind of layering effect that it has when you're sort of facing multiple types of disadvantage. So, yeah.
And it's funny because I read somewhere in one of your articles, you said that the music industry was the last one probably to start this conversation. Why? Music is something that really unites us, and it's a very universal thing to talk about. And I guess everybody in some context, and at some point in their lives will have listened to music, we just are surrounded by music. So why do you think that the music industry was so late to the party, so to speak?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I kind of, I don't have any super amount of evidence to back it up, but I know that other art forms have been having this conversation a lot longer. I think, if you take dance, if you take theatre, we're used to now seeing different types of bodies and different types of people on our stages, and sometimes I wonder if it's because music being a listening art form, we don't kind of, worry about people's physicalities as much, perhaps, or I also think it's just we've been a little bit lazy in music as well. We've been caught up with other things, and for whatever reason, it hasn't been a priority for discussion. Whereas I think there's been some great activists in some other art forms that have really kind of gone, come on, guys, the theatre sector, we really need to kind of address this and things. So, yeah, it's a shame. But I think the conversation is moving. It's moving along now, and it's slowly catching up, I would say.
Okay, so we've got the big picture now. Diversity, access, and inclusion are probably on everybody's mind nowadays. But there is still heaps to be done in this space, so that disabled musicians feel like they belong to the industry as well. That often has to do with the everyday language used around this topic. Many of us don't even realize we might be expressing ableism with our word choices, for instance. And just to clarify, by saying ableism, I mean the discrimination and social prejudice against people with disabilities or those perceived as being disabled, which might unfairly classify them as inferior to non-disabled people. So I thought it would be beneficial to ask Morwenna about how she sees it. And for that purpose, I referred to the example of two international megastars who recently used pretty unfortunate expressions in their lyrics. I just wanted to bring up the example of Lizzo and Beyonce, who probably unconsciously, unwillingly used, the very derogatory and very harmful language for disabled people. So do you see that problem in Australia in everyday communications as well?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think language, it's a powerful thing. It's also something for those people that do have some consciousness of it, it's something that can cause fear. There can be a lot of nervousness around saying the wrong thing, kind of the flip side to the Beyonce story, I guess, where there wasn't enough thought going on at all. And the problem with that fear around language is it can stop us actually talking about it. It can stop us actually, wanting to kind of dive in and have a conversation because we're worried about getting it wrong. And I think, my reflection on language is it's always about intent. And if language is respectful and people have the right intent with the language that they're using, that goes a long way. Having said that, I think the disability community, as you can imagine, has had a long history of having very negative words used about that community. Lots of examples I'm sure that spring to mind for people. And so language is certainly for some people quite a sensitive area. And that's completely understandable. I think all countries around the world use different types of language when it comes to disability. That makes things a little bit confusing as well. There's two kind of basic ways of thinking about disability language. Probably the most prevalent style in Australia at the moment is what we call people first language, where you say person with disability. So you put the person at the front of the sentence. And then there's also, which really comes from places like the UK, they tend to use what's called identity first language, so disabled person. And that's really around, for a lot of disabled people, there's a sense of pride in that, and it's a strong part of their identity. So really wanting to kind of bring that to the fore. And the thing about language is everyone will have their own personal way, that they choose. And so sometimes if I'm a music venue or festival, how do I know which one to go with? Because I'm never going to please everyone. But I think it's sort of sticking to one of those styles of language, using it consistently and knowing why you're using it. I think we are seeing a much kind of stronger rise in people using identity first language here in Australia now as we get this kind of movement of disability pride and people being more comfortable to identify and disclose. So I think that's definitely on the up and something we'll start to see more of here.
Okay. And I can't remember the name now. Your organization that, I only remember it because sometimes people, share movies with the sign language interpreters at festivals, because what is Auslan? Is it the name of the organization?
Auslan stands for Australian Sign Language. So something that not everyone knows is that sign language, just like, spoken language, is different in every country. So, and interestingly, with Australia and with English, we have Auslan here in Australia, we have British Sign Language in the UK, and we have American Sign Language in the US. So even though all of our spoken language is fairly similar, there are actually three different types of sign language for those English-speaking countries. So yes, it's Auslan here in Australia. And absolutely, Ability Fest is really leading by example in terms of having Auslan interpreters at music festivals. That's something that's still pretty new here for Australia, and not too many of them, certainly not contemporary music organisations are doing that. But it has been going for a lot longer in places like the US and the UK. And in fact, there's a fantastic interpreter in the US called Amber Galloway, who's she does a lot of the huge major acts in the US and signs for them, and she's got a real huge following now, just not just with the deaf community but other people as well, because her interpretations are so incredibly visually appealing and interesting, obviously primarily for the deaf community, but sort of more broader appeal as well. And what's fantastic about that, I think, is as we've seen that really grow in the US, some of those big artists that are, really open to having their work interpreted, and I think that's helped with the profile of it. And yeah, we're starting to see that happen here in Australia. There was a great, just before COVID, the Perth Festival had an AC/DC concert, and that was sign language interpreted. And there's a great video of that online that's kind of gone viral, and I think is working to help encourage more music performances to be interpreted here. And it sort of speaks to this, sometimes we have, our ingrained biases or stereotypes in our head of why would deaf people be interested in music, but that video really talks about what it is to be part of a festival experience or part of a performance experience. And of course there's different levels of deafness, different ways in which people might experience music through vibration, etc. So why should deaf people be excluded from coming to festivals? That's not right. And providing access through Auslan, through wearables, there's options now, which is really exciting. And I've recently been working with a couple of deaf musicians and just understanding their process about how they compose, how they write songs has been really fascinating. And it's such an individual experience for everyone, and of course for people with deafness, really individual as well in terms of how they go about that.
Yeah, and I have to be honest with you, from an able person's perspective, for me it was a revelation to hear about musicians who are hard of hearing or deaf in general. And then I realized that my perception was wrong, because obviously I kind of think of music as something that you hear. But like you said, the experience is different because it's about vibrations, and different things that you don't necessarily have to hear to experience as well. And that's why I think in the case of Australia, Auslan interpreters, that's an amazing job to me, because they not only do they interpret the words, so like the lyrics of the songs, but also kind of the songs vibe, and you sometimes see it, in their body movements. It's amazing. That's true. A great job.
And there are certain interpreters that are even good at kind of interpreting the emotions within just instrumental music. Yeah, so that's always really amazing to watch a good one of them.
True. Right. So since we're talking about using sign language translators at festivals, let's talk about those live music events in general. From my recent observations, I gather that more and more promoters and gig organizers include accessibility as one of their priorities these days. For instance, there are special platforms for punters with reduced mobility, quiet spaces for neurodiverse people, and separate tickets for those who accompany disabled music fans. But what about festivals specifically curated for disabled people and/or including disabled musicians? In Australia, there is one such event. So that's what we're chatting about in this next segment. So I know that you've got Ability Fest organized by Dylan, but is it the only Australian festival that is we can't say it's 100% focused on disabilities, because like you said, there are so many out there that it's hard to know because some of them are not visible. But this is particularly kind of like aimed at, welcoming everybody who might have some sort of disability. And I'm just wondering whether that's the only one of that sort in Australia, or do you start to see other events place more emphasis on it as well when it comes to festivals, for instance?
Yeah, we're definitely seeing a bit of a shift. Ability Fest has been fantastic because it has had that profile because of Dylan Alcott, our Australian of the Year, and it has had really good backing and support and expertise behind it to make sure that they do a good job of that festival. The thing with accessibility is, it's impossible to get it 100% right. There's always more layers or more things that you can add, but they do a good job. The good thing about that festival is there are so many different suppliers or promoters or artists that kind of have had exposure to that event now, that they've kind of taken some of those things, and we're starting to see that translate to other festivals and other parts of our industry too. So there can sometimes, around diversity and inclusion, there can sometimes be a bit of a debate around, do we need our own special thing where it's just, artists with disability, or do we just want to have a mainstream thing where there just happens to be artists with disability within it? And I kind of think that both are really important. It's great to have that spotlight and that kind of targeted, this festival is focused on. But some of our mainstream festivals, like Sydney Festival has just been on here recently, and for the last, I don't know, I want to say somewhere between 5 and 10 years, they've had a policy that says they will only program festival shows in accessible venues, and that's had a major influence in a city like Sydney, where unfortunately, because of a lot of our heritage buildings and things, there are a lot of inaccessible venues here. But it's kind of, the power of something like a major festival like that, making that stance. It's actually led to some fantastic changes, like one of our major theatres here in Sydney, Griffin Theatre, because they've been excluded for Sydney Festival for so many years because they've been inaccessible, they've just campaigned and received some major capital works money to become accessible. Wow. And if Sydney Festival kind of didn't do that thing of not programming them, would it have happened? I don't know, but it was certainly a useful kind of thing to get them there.
Yeah, you sometimes need the incentive to start thinking about it. That's true. Something about the Ability Fest. I wrote an article about it for my blog, and I think somewhere on Facebook I saw a conversation, and I can obviously understand that as well. That probably that was one of the issues that they haven't paid attention to yet, or it was just at that particular event. Someone criticized it for having the strobe lighting, and that's obviously something that can be a big problem for someone who is very sensitive to it. And it's funny because I thought there's someone doing something good about it, and then they're being criticized as well. So like you said, you can never get to 100%, and yeah.
And look, it keeps us all honest, and it's what makes working in this field so exciting, because there's always more work to do, like the work is never done,
True, yeah. And I think I've seen somewhere, or maybe you even have mentioned that throughout this chat as well, there's something like an access and inclusion rider now. I mean, it could be a part of a regular one, because, the regular one probably was like, this is what we eat, this is what gear we need, and that's it.
Yeah.
Whilst now I can see that a lot of different acts start incorporating, for instance, a sustainability part in it as well. So, to what extent the venue is willing to, go green with them, for instance. So what would be included in an access and inclusion rider? What sort of questions or, benchmarks for the venues, for instance?
Yeah, so I guess most commonly they're used by artists with disability themselves that have particular access requirements. So it might be, I need a wheelchair accessible green room or accessible toilet backstage, or, I need a ramp to get onto the stage, or it might be that, I need a quiet space where I can go and be away from people if I'm, neurodiverse. So we're seeing a lot more artists with disability include that as part of their rider kind of package. And what I think would be great is if all venues and festivals could just have that conversation with any artist that they're working with around, do you have any access requirements? Because asking that question kind of prompts people to go, actually, yes, I do. And now that you've asked me that, I feel comfortable and safe to share that information about what it is that I need to be able to do this gig, at my best for you. So, yeah, they're on the rise. We're seeing a lot more of them pop up here in Australia, and it's definitely something we want to make sure everyone across the industry is aware of, so that they're asking those good questions and prepared for access riders when they see them.
Now, in my humble opinion, if you don't see something, you don't know it exists. And even if you see it sometimes, you might still think it's not important enough, and it's okay to marginalize it. This is where representation comes into play. Again, I approach this topic from an able person's perspective, but I've recently realized there is a huge gap in what we see on the screens, in the movies, and at different types of events. Long story short, able people are an overwhelming majority. So I asked Morwenna to elaborate a bit about another creative industry she's familiar with first when it comes to disability and representation. And then she also talks me through a few organizations and projects whose main objectives are diversity, inclusion and accessibility in the arts sector in Australia. I recently watched a lot of the British TV, which I don't normally do. And because I hadn't been to the UK for some time as well, and I don't watch TVs from the English-speaking countries, let's say, so much anymore. And I think you guys are the more progressive ones, to be honest. I noticed there's a lot of people with disabilities who are represented on TV. So, and like compared to what I have at home, like I live in Spain. So for instance, I can compare it to that. Or like, when I'm home in Poland with my mom, this is not the case. So I just wanted to ask you, like, how you see it in Australia, where you guys are starting to be represented, and where it's still missing, like, hugely in the music business, especially.
Yeah. Thank you for bringing up representation, because it's such an important issue, because, you can't be what you can't see, and we really need role models and to be able to see ourselves reflected on stages, on screens, everywhere, to know that, we can have amazing lives on an equal level with anyone else. I think in terms of Screen, there's been some really good work done by our national funding body, Screen Australia. There's been a couple of organisations kind of start up, like the Screen Diversity Inclusion Network, and they've been doing some really interesting things around getting screen productions to start to measure and capture diversity data. Now, I know, people will have different views on, data and employment data and, those sorts of things. But the great thing about data is that you can really see and measure those kind of trends changing over time. So, for example, Screen Australia, I think back in 2015, did this big report looking at all television drama coming out of Australia, and they measured all the different characters on TV and what different types of diversity they represented. Now, of course, that's tricky because not every disability is visible, but it came in at something like 4% from memory, not up around that 18% where the population average is. But since then, there's been some great initiatives from broadcasters such as SBS and the ABC here in Australia, and they've had commissioning guidelines for their programs. So programs that are going to get commissioned by those broadcasters now have to meet a certain level of diversity to be successful in commissioning. And I really think this idea of having, kind of draw cards like that, or carrots, if you like, that attract people to go, oh, I want that money, so therefore I have to, think about my diversity. I think that's how we start to see change happen, because I think there's a lot of people that think fundamentally diversity is a good idea, but it can take a little bit more work. It might take a little bit more time. Access, can cost money if you need sign language interpreters or whatever. So I think having some really juicy carrots like that to attract our screen industry to make changes around diversity, we've really started to see that reflected in the kind of shows on TV and screen. So we just need to get our arts sector to come on that journey as well.
True, yeah. But speaking of organizations, events and institutions, maybe, if you could tell me a bit more about the ones that you've worked for. So you've mentioned Accessible Arts at the beginning. Can you expand on what the organization does, and if it's a part of any bigger institution or if it's just on its own, or who it's financed by, for instance?
Yeah, so here in Australia, most of our states and territories, though not all of them, have what you call a service organisation, which is around arts and disabilities. So they're organisations that are primarily government funded to be able to provide support to our arts and cultural sector, to help arts organisations improve their access and inclusion, and also to support artists with disability to have pathways and opportunities into the arts and within the arts. So Accessible Arts is the New South Wales version of those organisations. There's also a national peak body called Arts Access Australia. They all receive kind of different levels of funding. They all do slightly different types of activity, but at their core, it's around helping us as an arts sector be better at this stuff. Because if it's not your own lived experience, if it's not something that, you've had anything
Yeah.
to do with. How on earth do you know how to go about it or where to start? So a lot of them do, professional development or skills development workshops, that kind of thing, to help, or training to help with some of the upskilling as well for people in the art sector.
And I've got a note here, and I don't know where I found it. Hack Sounds in Sydney, an organization. Does it ring a bell? Yeah. What do they
Yes.
do?
Yes, I think it's still going. It was a sort of project come out of an organisation / venue here in Sydney called 107 Projects, and essentially it was about inclusive music making. So for people with and without disability, making electronic music together, because I think one of the great things to remember is all of the kind of tech possibilities around assistive music technology that is out there. So it really opens up. It's really opened up the world for people, and some people with disability who might have, for example, mobility or physical reasons why they might not be able to play an instrument, but they might be able to get on some Ableton gear or something and, be able to make music in other ways. And so that was a great project that essentially brought people with and without disability together to just have these sort of wonderful once a week creative development sessions to work on songs together, have some mentoring, do some recording. And there's been a few little projects like that pop up, but I'm not sure if that one's still going, unfortunately.
Okay. And again, I looked at my notes because I've got them here, and I also see, I just forgot to mention that before, that one of your peers and potentially colleagues is by Eliza Hall. She's also been doing a very good job in advocacy on that topic, and she was nominated, this year for the Done Good Award, which, like you mentioned, it's the Triple J, I think they do that.
Oh, yes.
It was awarded to Kobe D, First Nations artist, but Eliza was nominated. And I heard her, I think she was in the Q&A once on TV, and she performed on that program as well. But I found something that she was doing, possibly a podcast called Accessible All Areas or something of that.
Yeah, it was actually it was an incredible online festival that she organised during lockdown. I think it was maybe a year and a bit ago now. Eliza is fantastic. She's an incredible disabled singer-songwriter from Victoria. She is a fantastic disability advocate and activist. She's also now started writing books. She's published a couple of books recently, so way too talented. And yes, this particular festival, she basically brought together a whole bunch of pals of musicians with disability from around the world to create this incredible online concert for people in their homes during lockdown. And in fact, she was telling me just recently that Ruth Lyon, who's a songwriter from the UK, they're doing a kind of really cool exchange this year where I think Eliza's going to the UK to tour with her, and then she's coming to Australia to tour with Eliza, and they'll be meeting with sort of key people from the music industry in both countries, and access experts and organisations as well. So yeah, she's a great person to watch, and she's won, even if she didn't win that Triple J award, she's won lots of other awards. So she's going places, and she's doing so well. She's also just joined the board of Music Victoria, so it's really great to see a mainstream music body, with people with disability represented on their board in their governance structure. So yeah, that's fantastic to see too.
Okay, so I reckon Morwenna has provided a solid foundation to understand how diversity, access and inclusion can benefit the music business in Australia and overseas. While there is still much to be done to address some points, like inviting more disabled musicians to perform at popular events and ensuring the site facilities are ready to welcome them without obstacles, things are moving in the right direction. So if you're interested in the work of the organizations and projects mentioned throughout this chat that are working towards a greater accessibility awareness, for instance, check the show's notes for links to their websites. I also strongly encourage you to visit Morwenna's page. It's full of practical resources and case studies, many of which are ready to be implemented. You can find me on socials as @CityMcWiggles. Also, feel free to browse my citymcwiggles.blog for more music-related content, especially if you're an Aussie music fan. My conversation with Morwenna is not finished yet, however. In the upcoming Silly Encore episode, we'll be chatting about her career, research, and some tips she has for me to improve access on my channels. Thank you for tuning in today. I hope it was a well-spent half an hour. I'll catch you in the next episode. Take care.